I want you, the listener, to just take a second and imagine an enemy that, that killed roughly 30% of its victims.
Which is just a massive number right out of the gate.
It really is. And if you happen to be, one of the lucky ones who actually survived the initial onslaught, it often blinded you. Or it left you covered in these deep, permanent scars, basically branding you for the entire rest of your life.
Yeah, a constant physical reminder.
Exactly. I mean, we are talking about an enemy that didn't just end lives in the millions. It actively reshaped entire empires. It decided the outcomes of major wars. It brought, entire global civilizations to their absolute knees.
It really did.
And then after centuries of just this unchecked terror in what honestly has to be the absolute pinnacle of human coordination, it became the first, and to this day, the only infectious human disease to be completely 100% eradicated from nature.
Which, I mean, is just a staggering reality when you pause to really consider the scope of it. We are, of course, talking about smallpox.
Well, smallpox.
But, setting the stage with those historical stakes, it's vital. Because looking at smallpox merely as this defeated historical curiosity, well, it misses the point entirely.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Because we are here to just, do a dusty retrospective victory lap.
No, not at all.
We are going to explore the actual treacherous mountain that humanity had to climb to beat this thing. I mean, we need to unpack the terrifying biology of this ancient killer and look at how human societies inadvertently built the very highways used to travel the globe.
Yeah, the human element is huge.
It is. And we want to dive into the grueling, completely unglamorous grind, the door-to-door surveillance, the ethical minefields, the sheer logistics that finally stopped it.
Because the summit of that mountain is not the end of our story today either. Smallpox offers basically the ultimate shortcut to understanding how civilization fundamentally protects itself.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, it teaches us that victory in public health is never just about someone having a eureka moment in a laboratory.
Right, the science isn't enough on its own.
Exactly. Having a brilliant scientific discovery or a vaccine just sitting in a glass vial that doesn't actually save a single human life by itself. Beating a pathogen requires memory, it requires immense public trust, and it requires a level of vigilance that really goes against human nature.
So let's start with the biology, because to understand how we eventually dismantled this threat, we have to, understand the machinery of the beast itself. We're dealing with the variola virus here.
Variola virus, yes.
And just looking at the sources we have, this was not a typical virus. It didn't behave like the pathogens that dominate our news cycles today, like influenza or the common cold.
Not at all, no. Smallpox was caused by the variola virus, which falls under the category of an orthopox virus. And the first thing you have to understand about variola is its sheer, imposing physical size and its genetic complexity.
Wait, size? Like it's physically bigger?
Yeah, much bigger. It was this massive, brick-shaped, double-stranded DNA virus. To put that in perspective, a lot of the viruses we worry about today, they are RNA viruses, which are, smaller, they're more unstable, and they mutate rapidly.
Okay.
Variola was a heavyweight, and its replication process was entirely unorthodox.
Okay, let's unpack how it replicated then, because this is where the mechanics get really fascinating to me.
So when a typical DNA virus invades a human cell, it has a very specific destination in mind. It needs to travel all the way into the cell's nucleus.
Right, the center of the cell.
Exactly. The nucleus is essentially the heavily guarded central command center of the cell, where all the genetic copying machinery and the raw materials are stored.
Makes sense.
So the standard virus, it breaks into the cell, sneaks into that central nucleus, and hijacks the machinery to print copies of itself. But pox viruses, and variola in particular, they don't do that.
They don't go to the nucleus at all.
They don't even bother trying to get into the nucleus. They set up shop and replicate right out in the cytoplasm, which is, the jelly-like fluid that fills the space between the cell membrane and the nucleus.
Wait, so, okay, if a normal virus is like a tiny burglar picking a lock to sneak into a building's central safe to steal the printing press, variola was more like a siege engine.
A siege engine, yeah, I like that.
Like it just rolled into the courtyard, brought its own carpenters, its own blueprints, and its own lumber, and just built a counterfeit printing press right there in the open fluid of the cytoplasm.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. It was a siege engine. Because it didn't rely on the host cell's nucleus for replication, well, it had to bring an enormous genetic toolkit with it.
Because it's building from scratch.
Exactly. The variola genome encoded roughly 200 of its own proteins. It brought its own enzymes to build what virologists literally call viral factories inside the cytoplasm.
Viral factories, wow.
But it didn't just bring construction tools, it brought heavy artillery to essentially blind the host's immune system.
Meaning it could actively shut down our body's natural alarm bells.
Precisely. The human body has these really sophisticated early warning systems. For example, we have interferons, which are signaling proteins released by infected cells to tell the neighboring cells, hey, heighten your antiviral defenses.
Like a neighborhood watch.
And we have cytokines, which orchestrate the immune response, and the complement system, which is basically a series of proteins that act like tripwires to tag and destroy pathogens.
Okay, so how did variola get past all that?
Variola brought specific proteins that acted like wire cutters. It would bind to our interferons and completely neutralize them. It would block the complement system tripwires.
It just turned everything off.
It essentially draped this cloak of biological camouflage over itself, allowing it to just multiply unbothered.
Which perfectly explains the brutal clinical pattern of the disease. I mean, if you were exposed to variola, you would enter this silent incubation period.
Yes, the silent period.
The sources say this lasted anywhere from 7 to 19 days, averaging around 10 to 14 days. And during those 2 weeks, you felt absolutely fine.
Completely fine.
You could be carrying the siege engine, and you wouldn't have a scratch or a snuffle.
We can look at the illness in 3 distinct phases, really, and that incubation period is phase 1, the hidden climb.
The climb.
You inhale the virus through respiratory droplets. It sets up its initial camp in your respiratory tract, your throat, and your airways. And because of those molecular wire cutters we just talked about, your immune system is completely oblivious.
Just totally in the dark.
Right. The virus multiplies locally, and then it quietly slips into your local lymph nodes. And you still feel perfectly healthy.
Then we hit phase 2. The camouflage starts to slip. Or rather, I guess there's just too much virus to hide anymore. This is the systemic fever and the pain phase.
Yeah, I call this the supply line capture. The virus moves from the lymph nodes into your bloodstream, which is a phase called viremia.
Okay, viremia.
It uses the blood to travel to your spleen, your bone marrow, and your liver. It starts replicating on a massive scale. At this point, around day 12 or 14, the sheer volume of the virus overwhelmed those early evasion tactics.
The alarm finally goes off.
The body's immune system suddenly wakes up, realizes the house is entirely on fire, and mounts a desperate, violent response.
That's when the patient suddenly collapses. I mean, the descriptions from the primary sources are just harrowing. Extreme prostration, a fever spiking to 104 or 105 degrees.
Severe, splitting back pain, vomiting.
Yeah, it looks like a terrible case of the flu or malaria at first. But the defining horror hasn't even shown up yet. There's still no rash.
The rash is phase 3, the flag on the skin. After a few days of that intense fever, the virus travels back into the bloodstream and heads for the mucous membranes and the skin. This is where the physical destruction becomes visible.
It surfaces.
And the skin lesions progress through a very specific, agonizing evolution.
Break that progression down for us, actually. Because medical texts always list these terms, macules, papules, vesicles. But it's important to understand what the patient is actually experiencing physically.
Sure. It starts as macules, which are just flat red spots appearing on the tongue and the roof of the mouth, then spreading to the face and arms.
Just flat red spots.
Right. Within a day or two, those flat spots become raised into hard bumps, papules. Then they fill with a clear fluid, becoming vesicles.
Okay.
Finally, they turn into pustules. And, a smallpox pustule was not like a chickenpox blister.
How so?
Well, a chickenpox blister is superficial. It sits on the surface of the skin. A smallpox pustule was deep, firm, and opaque. It felt like a hard little bead or a BB just buried deep in the dermal layer.
Oh, wow. That sounds excruciating.
It was. Eventually, over the second week of the rash, these pustules would crust over into scabs.
And the distribution of these lesions was highly specific, wasn't it? The sources call it a centrifugal distribution.
Centrifugal, yes.
Instead of clustering on the chest and stomach like a lot of rashes do, variola concentrated heavily on the face, the arms, and the legs. It even covered the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Why did it target the extremities like that?
Virologists believe it has to do with temperature gradients in the body. The variola virus seemed to replicate more efficiently at temperatures just slightly below the core body temperature.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, your chest and abdomen are the hottest parts of your body, right? Hovering right around 98.6 degrees or higher during a fever. Your face, arms, legs, and especially your hands and feet, they are slightly cooler.
So it moves to the cooler areas.
Exactly. The virus naturally thrived and caused the most severe tissue damage in those slightly cooler peripheral areas.
That makes biological sense, but it also creates this incredibly cruel irony. The virus concentrates its destruction on the most visible, socially interactive parts of the human body, the face and the hands.
It's devastating for the survivors, yeah.
But I want to explore a misconception about how this virus actually moved from person to person. Because when we think of a horrifying, world-ending contagion today, we often picture something like measles, which is fiercely airborne.
Right. Highly contagious through the air.
Like someone with measles can cough in an empty room, leave, and 2 hours later you walk into that room and catch it. Variola wasn't like that, was it? The sources show its basic reproduction number. It's R0, which is the number of people one sick person infects in a completely susceptible population, was around 3.5 to 6.
That is a critical distinction to draw. Smallpox was not fully airborne in the way measles is, where tiny aerosols just hang suspended in the air currents for hours.
Okay, so how did it move?
It relied primarily on what we call large respiratory droplet transmission.
Meaning you had to be relatively close to the person?
Very close. Prolonged face-to-face contact. The highest period of contagion aligned perfectly with phase 3, the rash. As those macules and papules formed inside the patient's mouth and throat, they would break open, shedding absolutely massive viral loads into the saliva.
Right into the mouth and throat.
Exactly. When the patient spoke, coughed, or sneezed, they expelled these heavy, virus-laden droplets. Because the droplets were heavy, they fell to the ground quickly.
So they don't float around.
Right. So you generally had to be within about 6 feet of the patient, sharing the same air for a sustained period to catch it.
It could also spread through fomites, right, like contaminated objects.
Yes, and this was uniquely dangerous with smallpox because of the scabs. As the pustules dried out, the live virus was basically encased and protected within the hardened scabs.
Oh, wow. So the scab is basically a little virus bunker.
That's a good way to put it. Those scabs could flake off onto bed sheets, blankets, and clothing. A family member shaking out the bed linens of a smallpox patient could aerosolize that tracked virus and inhale it. But again, this requires close physical proximity to the patient or their immediate belongings.
So an R0 of 3.5 to 6 means it was actually significantly slower than a disease like measles, which has an R0 of anywhere from 12 to 18. That slowness feels like a vulnerability.
It was its greatest biological vulnerability. Smallpox was a terror, but it was not supernatural. If it had spread like measles hanging in the air of grocery stores and train stations, well, eradicating it with mid-20th century technology might have been biologically impossible.
The tools just wouldn't have kept up.
No, they wouldn't have. The fact that it required close, prolonged contact gave public health workers a fighting chance to track it.
And the fact that people were generally not contagious during that 2-week silent incubation period, you couldn't be a super spreader while feeling perfectly healthy.
Exactly.
You didn't start blasting the virus into the room until those sores opened in your mouth, which happened right as you became visibly, severely ill. The disease literally painted a giant, recognizable target on its host.
The symptoms were so distinct that you didn't need a complex laboratory PCR test to diagnose it. A trained health worker could walk into a village, look across a crowded room, and immediately identify the threat.
We have this massive siege engine of a virus. It's biologically vulnerable because it's slow and visible, but here's where the story shifts from biology to human ambition.
Yes, the human factor.
Because that 10 to 14-day silent incubation period, it might not have made the person contagious yet, but it made the virus the ultimate stowaway.
The perfect stowaway.
You could get infected in one city, feel completely fine, hop on a merchant ship, or march with an army for 2 straight weeks, cross vast distances, and only erupt in a highly contagious fever and rash once you arrived at your destination.
The biology of the virus was perfectly calibrated to exploit the speed of human travel. Variola became a passenger on basically every major human endeavor: trade, conquest, forced migration, war.
Looking at the origins, humanity has been dealing with this for a staggeringly long time. I mean, historically, people always point to the Egyptian mummies, specifically Pharaoh Ramses V, who died over 3,000 years ago.
Right, Ramses V.
His mummified head shows this raised, pustular rash, but looking at a 3,000-year-old dried bump and proving it's smallpox are two different things, right?
Visual evidence on a mummy is compelling for sure, but it's circumstantial. It could be monkeypox, it could be a severe case of chickenpox, or it could be an entirely unrelated skin disease.
So we didn't know for sure.
Well, modern science has actually provided definitive proof from an entirely different part of the world. Paleogeneticists have extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of human remains found in northern Europe, dating back to the Viking era, roughly between 600 and 1050 CE.
Wait, why extract it from the teeth?
Because the hard enamel of the tooth acts as a protective vault for the pulp inside. And remember phase 2 of the smallpox infection? The viremia.
Oh, right, when it floods the bloodstream.
Exactly. The virus heavily infiltrates the bloodstream. Blood circulates through the dental pulp. When the person dies, the virus's DNA is preserved inside the tooth for centuries.
That is incredible.
By sequencing this DNA, scientists definitively proved that diverse strains of the variola virus were circulating widely in medieval northern Europe. It confirms that the virus was evolving and traveling alongside human populations far earlier and far more broadly than we previously had hard genomic evidence for.
So as global trade routes expand, as empires reach across oceans, the virus just rides along, and the most catastrophic collision of human ambition and this virus happens when it reaches the Americas.
Yes, a dark chapter.
In 1520, smallpox arrives in Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. The estimates in the sources are that it wiped out roughly 40% of the city's population in a single year.
Which is almost unfathomable.
But we really need to pause here, because there is a very common, oversimplified historical narrative that says, well, the indigenous populations had no biological immunity, so the germs just did the work. That narrative ignores the actual mechanics of how human societies handle illness.
The virgin soil narrative is incredibly dangerous because it strips away all human agency and context. Yes, the indigenous populations of the Americas lacked prior biological exposure to the variola virus, meaning they had no acquired antibodies. But biological vulnerability alone does not cause a 40% mortality rate in a single year.
Right. It's what else is happening to that society at the exact same moment.
Exactly. When smallpox struck Tenochtitlan, the virus was arriving alongside violent colonization. The city was under military siege by the Spanish and their local allies. Consider the logistics of caregiving here.
Like just basic nursing.
Right. If someone gets smallpox in a stable society, they are incapacitated, but their family brings them water, they cool their fever, and they feed them. They have a higher chance of surviving the immune system's massive battle.
But what happens when 30% of the adults in a household get sick simultaneously while the city is blockaded?
There is no one left to haul the water, there is no one to harvest the crops, the social immune system collapses.
The social immune system, wow.
People didn't just die from the variola virus, they died from dehydration, starvation, and exposure because the societal structures of care, agriculture, and defense were deliberately being dismantled by invaders at the same time. The virus had no politics, but its devastation was entirely amplified by political violence.
And sometimes that weaponization wasn't just a byproduct of conquest, it was a deliberate tactic. We have explicit documentary evidence of this from the Fort Pitt incident in 1763 during Pontiac's War in North America.
This is a really chilling moment in the historical record. British forces were besieged at Fort Pitt by an alliance of Native American warriors. We have letters between the British commander, General Geoffrey Amherst, and Colonel Henry Bouquet.
What did the letters say?
They explicitly discuss the idea of sending smallpox among the native populations to, quote, extirpate this execrable race.
They literally discuss the mechanics of biological warfare. And the officers at the fort actually carried it out, right? William Trent, a local trader and militia commander inside the fort, wrote in his journal that during a parley with native representatives, they gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken directly from the fort's smallpox hospital.
They understood fomite transmission. They knew the scabs trapped in those blankets were infectious. Now, historians and epidemiologists debate how much of the subsequent massive outbreak among the Ohio Valley tribes was directly caused by those specific blankets versus the virus naturally spreading through the region's existing trade and conflict networks.
Sure, tracing the exact epidemiological source is tough.
Right, but the epidemiological effectiveness of those 2 blankets is almost beside the point. The documentary evidence of the intent is undeniable. It proves that military leaders viewed this biological monster as a legitimate tool of terror.
And that terror shaped the very birth of the United States. During the American Revolution, from 1775 to roughly 1782, a massive smallpox epidemic swept across the entire North American continent. The historian Elizabeth Fenn famously dubbed this the Pax Americana.
Pax Americana,
It
yes.
was hitting everyone. It was ravaging the Continental Army, the British forces, the civilian populations, enslaved people seeking freedom behind British lines, and indigenous nations all the way to the Pacific Northwest. The war caused massive troop movements, and the troops carried the virus.
If you look at the entirety of this history, smallpox functioned as a brutal moral X-ray for human civilization. It consistently punished unequal systems. It punished overcrowding, poverty, forced migration, and slavery.
How so? Like practically.
Well, if you were wealthy and powerful during an outbreak in London or Boston, you had options. You could flee the dense city for a country estate. You could isolate yourself in a well-ventilated room. You could afford physicians.
But if you were an enslaved person on a crowded plantation, or an impoverished laborer living in a tenement, or a conscripted soldier packed into barracks, you couldn't run. Your living conditions provided the virus with the dense, interconnected networks of warm bodies it needed to jump from host to host.
The disease preyed on the cracks in human society.
So humanity is facing a virus that exploits our biology, exploits the speed of our ships, and exploits our societal inequalities. People didn't just sit back and accept this.
No, they fought back.
Long before anyone knew what a double-stranded DNA virus was, long before the invention of the microscope, humans developed a method to fight back. But it involved a terrifying gamble. Let's talk about the practice of variolation.
Variolation is one of the most profound examples of human observation in history. It proves that communities understood the concept of acquired immunity centuries before the science of virology existed.
They just saw the pattern.
They recognized a very simple pattern. If you survived smallpox once, you never caught it again. You were shielded for life.
The logic then becomes, how do we get the shield without taking the 30% risk of dying from a natural infection?
The answer was variolation. It involved intentionally taking infectious material from a person suffering from smallpox and introducing it into the body of a healthy person.
Wait, on purpose?
On purpose.
Okay.
We have documentation of this practice in China dating back to the mid-1500s, where they would grind up dried smallpox scabs and use a long silver tube to blow the infectious dust up the nostrils of a healthy person.
Wow.
In the Ottoman Empire and parts of Africa, the method was cutaneous. They would take a needle or a lancet, dip it into the fluid of a smallpox pustule, and literally scratch it into the skin of the patient's arm.
We have to pause and absorb the sheer risk of this.
Mm.
They were not using a weakened vaccine. They were taking the live, fully lethal variola virus and intentionally infecting healthy children and adults with it.
The gamble was based on the route of infection. When you catch smallpox naturally, you inhale it deep into your respiratory tract, allowing the virus to establish a massive beachhead in your lungs and lymph nodes before your immune system realizes what's happening.
Right, the silent incubation we talked about.
Exactly. The hypothesis behind variolation was that by introducing the virus through an unnatural route, a scratch on the arm or the nasal mucosa, it forced the virus to replicate locally in the skin or nose feast.
So it slows it down.
This local, slower replication gave the immune system a head start. It recognized the threat and built antibodies before the virus could achieve that massive systemic viremia.
And it largely worked, right?
Yeah.
Most people who were variolated developed a mild fever, maybe a dozen pustules around the scratch site, and then recovered completely with lifelong immunity.
It did work, but the risk was always there. Sometimes the virus won the race anyway. About 1 to 2% of people who underwent variolation developed full-blown severe smallpox and died.
That is still a real risk.
And perhaps even more dangerous from a societal perspective. A variant-related person was shedding live virus. If they didn't strictly isolate while they recovered, they could breathe on a susceptible neighbor and ignite a catastrophic natural epidemic in their own town.
It's the ultimate philosophical trade-off. You are choosing a dangerous, controlled risk, a 2% chance of dying, to avoid an uncontrollable, terrifying risk, a 30% chance of dying if the disease sweeps through your town naturally.
And this practice slowly began to cross cultures. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, observed the practice in Constantinople. She was a smallpox survivor herself, bearing the facial scars, and she had lost her brother to the disease.
So she knew the stakes.
She was so convinced by the effectiveness of variolation that she had her own children variolated and fiercely championed the practice in Britain in the early 1700s.
But there's another channel of this knowledge transfer that happened right around the same time, in America, that highlights the complex power dynamics of medical history. It's 1721. A massive smallpox epidemic is sweeping through Boston. The death toll is climbing rapidly, and the Puritan minister Cotton Mather begins aggressively advocating for variolation. But he didn't learn about it from Lady Mary in London.
No, he
He
didn't.
learned about it from an enslaved African man named Onesimus.
Onesimus had been purchased and given to Mather as a gift by his congregation years earlier. When Mather asked him if he had ever had smallpox, Onesimus explained that he had undergone an operation back in West Africa. He described how fluid was scratched into his arm, giving him a mild case of the disease and granting him lifelong protection.
Mather listens, he investigates further, and he becomes convinced. He partners with a local physician, Zabdiel Boylston, and they begin variolating hundreds of people in Boston amid massive public backlash.
People were terrified.
Someone literally threw a small explosive device through Mather's window with a note attached, furious that he was intentionally spreading the disease.
But the data vindicated Onesimus and Mather. When the Boston outbreak finally ended, the statistics were stark. Of the thousands who caught smallpox naturally, roughly 14% died. Of the hundreds who were variolated by Boylston, only about 2% died.
It's a medical triumph, but the historical injustice surrounding Onesimus is profound. Here's a man who is ripped from his home, stripped of his freedom, and enslaved in a foreign land. Yet he holds this deeply valuable, life-saving cultural knowledge.
It's an incredible story of knowledge transfer.
And he shares it. It saves the very community that is subjugating him. And what does he get? He doesn't get a medical degree. He isn't freed as a reward. He remains enslaved. It highlights how deeply global and localized knowledge intertwine to advance public health, and how often the institutions of power take the shield while continuing to oppress the people who handed it to them.
It is a profound epistemic injustice. It shows that public health and social power are never separate. But despite the risks, variolation remained the standard of defense in the Western world for the rest of the 18th century. That is, until a fundamental scientific pivot in 1796.
Enter Edward Jenner and the birth of the modern vaccine.
Jenner was an English physician who investigated a piece of local rural folklore. Dairymaids, the young women who milked cows, were famously known for having clear complexions, unscarred by smallpox.
The folklore suggested they were immune.
Right. The folklore suggested that because the milkmaids occasionally caught a mild disease from the cows called cowpox, which caused a few sores on their hands but nothing systemic, they somehow became immune to the deadly human smallpox.
So Jenner decides to put this folklore to the ultimate, and by today's standards, wildly unethical test.
Oh, completely unethical today.
He finds a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms, who has active cowpox lesions on her hand. He extracts fluid from her sores and scratches it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy gets a mild fever and a little sore and recovers in a few days. Then Jenner takes live, lethal smallpox matter and attempts to variolate the boy.
Which is the terrifying moment of truth. If the folklore is wrong, Jenner has just given an 8-year-old a potentially fatal disease.
It's a massive gamble.
But the boy doesn't get sick. No fever, no rash. The immune system had already been trained. Jenner had discovered the mechanism of cross-protection.
How does that work biologically?
Because the cowpox virus and the variola virus are in the same orthopox virus family, they share similar structural proteins. The boy's immune system built antibodies against the harmless cowpox that perfectly fit the deadly smallpox.
You no longer had to gamble with the live variola virus. You didn't have to risk a 2% mortality rate or sparking a new epidemic just to get the shield. This is the origin of the word vaccine, derived from vaca, the Latin word for cow.
Right, vac.
But let's clarify something critical about the modern era, because there is a lot of confusion about what is actually inside the strategic stockpiles of smallpox vaccines today.
This is a vital point to clarify. When we talk about modern smallpox vaccines, like the ACAM 2000 or JYN-NEOS vaccines held in national stockpiles today, they do not contain the cowpox virus, and they absolutely, under no circumstances, contain the variola virus.
So, to be clear, you cannot catch smallpox from a smallpox vaccine.
You cannot.
So what exactly is the active ingredient?
The active ingredient is a virus called vaccinia. Vaccinia is an orthopox virus. It is related to variola, which is why it provides that same cross-protective immunity. But it is genetically distinct. We don't actually know the precise evolutionary origin of vaccinia, whether it evolved from cowpox, horsepox, or a combination over decades of laboratory cultivation. But it is the global standard.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand how the two main modern vaccines differ.
Because one is replicating and one is non-replicating. How does that change the patient experience?
So ACAM 2000 is what we call a replicating vaccine. It contains live vaccinia virus. When it is scratched into the surface of the skin, the vaccinia virus actually infects the skin cells and begins multiplying locally.
Okay, so it makes a local infection.
Right. This creates a highly effective, robust immune response, but it also creates a localized infection, a live, open sore that scabs over and eventually leaves a small, characteristic scar on the arm.
I remember seeing those small, round scars on the upper arms of my parents and grandparents. That was the replicating vaccine at work. But because it's a live replicating infection, there are risks, right?
Yes. For a healthy person, the risk is minimal. But if a person has a severely compromised immune system or if they have a history of skin conditions like eczema, the vaccinia virus can escape the local injection site and cause a severe, widespread, and potentially life-threatening systemic infection.
That's dangerous.
That is why science developed the second type, the non-replicating vaccine, like JYNES.
How does a non-replicating vaccine train the immune system if it can't multiply?
JYNEOS uses a strain of vaccinia that has been highly attenuated, meaning it has been genetically weakened through repeated laboratory culturing. The virus is injected into the body. It enters the human cells and starts the process of presenting its proteins to the immune system.
So the immune system sees it.
The immune system sees it, recognizes the threat, and builds the protective antibodies. But the virus is so weakened that it lacks the genetic machinery to actually complete the replication cycle and burst out of the cell to infect others.
It just hits a wall.
It trains the immune system and then hits a dead end. It is drastically safer for vulnerable populations because it cannot cause an expanding infection.
So humanity achieves this incredible scientific milestone. We have a safe, effective tool to prevent the most devastating disease in human history.
We have the shield.
But here's the most sobering statistic of this entire deep dive. As we moved into the 20th century, we had the vaccine. We knew precisely how to stop the virus. And yet in the 20th century alone, smallpox still killed an estimated 300 to 500 million people. Let that number sink in.
It's hard to even comprehend.
500 million human beings died from a disease that we had the scientific knowledge to prevent.
It is the hardest truth in the history of public health. Scientific knowledge is not a magical barrier. A vaccine sitting in a glass vial inside a refrigerated laboratory in Geneva or Atlanta does absolutely nothing to stop a virus moving through a crowded market in Bangladesh or a village in Somalia.
The tool has to reach the people.
And it has to reach them safely, consistently, equitably, and critically. It must be received with trust.
Which brings us to the actual climb, the eradication effort. In 1967, the World Health Organization looked at the map, saw that smallpox was still endemic in over 30 countries, and launched the Intensified Global Smallpox Eradication Program. Initially, their strategy was straightforward. Mass vaccination.
Right, mass vaccination.
They wanted to vaccinate 80% of the population in every endemic country, assuming that would provide enough herd immunity to starve the virus.
But they quickly realized that mass vaccination on a global scale was not only logistically nearly impossible, but it was also fundamentally flawed biologically.
Why did it fail? I mean, if you vaccinate 80% of a city, shouldn't the virus just hit a wall?
In theory, yes. But human populations don't mix perfectly like water in a glass. People cluster. You might achieve 80% vaccination across a whole nation, but maybe an entire neighborhood or an entire rural province gets missed because of poor roads, civil war, or a lack of medical infrastructure.
And the virus finds them.
Variola is an incredibly patient siege engine. It would find that one unvaccinated pocket, that one crowded tenement, and it would explode. The mass vaccination strategy was like trying to put out a forest fire by randomly spraying water over the entire forest from an airplane. A lot of water gets wasted on trees that aren't on fire while the actual flames keep burning.
So they needed a strategic pivot. They had to stop blanket spraying and start fighting the fire at the source. This is the birth of the surveillance and containment strategy, which we commonly call ring vaccination.
Ring vaccination requires an entirely different operational mindset. Instead of trying to vaccinate everyone, you become a virus hunter. Your primary goal is surveillance, finding the active virus.
Okay, so you find someone who is sick.
When a health worker discovers a person with smallpox, they immediately isolate that patient. Then, the intense detective work begins. They interview the patient and trace every single person they have come into contact with over the past 2 weeks.
Family members, the person they bought vegetables from, the person they sat next to on a bus.
Every single one. And the health workers immediately vaccinate all of those primary contacts. But they don't stop there. They track down the contacts of those contacts, the secondary wing, and vaccinate them too.
Drawing a circle around the virus.
They literally draw a biological firewall, a ring of fresh immunity, entirely around the infected patient. The virus tries to jump to the next host, but it hits an immune barrier and dies out.
It's an elegant concept, but the logistics of executing that on a global scale are almost incomprehensible. It's not a magic wand, it's the grind. It is millions of health workers repeating the absolute hardest steps day in and day out. Search, verify, trace, vaccinate, document, return to verify again.
And under extreme conditions.
They had to deal with monsoon seasons, washed-out roads, active war zones, and massive language barriers.
And to do that, they needed tools designed for frugality and durability, not just high-tech laboratories. Two technological innovations made ring vaccination possible in the field. The first was the freeze-dried vaccine.
Solving the cold chain problem.
Exactly. Liquid vaccines spoil rapidly if they aren't kept strictly refrigerated. Try maintaining a constant refrigerator temperature while carrying a cooler on your back for 3 days through the tropical heat of the Amazon or rural India. It's impossible.
Yeah, the ice just melts.
Scientists developed a process to freeze-dry the vaccinia virus into a stable powder that could withstand intense heat for weeks. The health worker only had to mix it with a liquid diluent right before applying it.
And the second innovation was how they actually applied it to the skin. The bifurcated needle.
The bifurcated needle is a masterpiece of frugal engineering. It looks like a tiny stainless steel sewing needle, but the very tip is split into two tiny prongs, like a microscopic tuning fork.
How does that change the game compared to, just a standard syringe?
It's all about physics and efficiency. When a health worker dipped the bifurcated needle into a vial of the reconstituted vaccine, the surface tension of the liquid would hold exactly 1 microdrop of vaccine perfectly suspended between the two prongs.
Oh, that is so clever.
It was an automatic, foolproof measuring device. You didn't need to read the lines on a syringe.
And then the application process was incredibly simple.
You hold the needle at a right angle to the patient's upper arm, and you rapidly prick the skin 15 times in a small circle. The needle punctures the very top layer of the skin, depositing the vaccine perfectly.
15 quick pricks.
It used a fraction of the amount of vaccine compared to older scratching methods, allowing a single vial to protect far more people. It was cheap to manufacture, easy to sterilize over an open flame, and crucially, it required almost zero formal medical training to use correctly. You could teach a local village volunteer how to use a bifurcated needle flawlessly in 10 minutes.
Which highlights who the real heroes of this eradication climb were. The architects at the WHO in Geneva were vital, but the people who pulled humanity up the final stretch of the mountain were the hundreds of thousands of local health workers.
The ones on the ground?
The people who walked the dusty miles, the people who carried flashcards with pictures of a smallpox rash, showing them to illiterate populations and asking, have you seen anyone with these marks? They tracked down the rumors, crossed the rivers, and built the rings.
What's fascinating from a biological perspective is that the variola virus itself inadvertently enabled this strategy. We talked earlier about its vulnerabilities, but when you look at the eradication criteria, smallpox was uniquely susceptible to being wiped out. First, humans were its only natural reservoir.
There was no animal hiding the virus in the jungle.
Exactly. Unlike Ebola, which hides in bats, or influenza, which circulates in birds and pigs, variola only infected humans. If you cleared the virus from the human population, it had nowhere else to retreat and rebuild its numbers. Second, as we discussed, there was no asymptomatic carrier state.
You always knew who was sick.
You didn't have people silently shedding the virus for months without knowing it. If a person was contagious, they were visibly severely ill with a highly recognizable rash.
You didn't have to test a whole village to find the virus. You just had to look.
And finally, the vaccine provided durable, long-lasting immunity with a single application. You didn't need to return 6 months later for a booster shot. Biology provided the precise parameters that made eradication possible. But relentless, grueling human discipline is what made it real.
And that discipline culminated in two incredible historic moments. In 1975, in a village in Bangladesh, health workers tracked down a 3-year-old girl named Rahima Banu. She was suffering from the rash and fever. They immediately threw a massive, impenetrable ring of vaccination around her village.
They moved fast.
She survived, and the chain of transmission stopped with her. Rahima Banu became the last person on the entire planet to be naturally infected with variola major, the deadliest form of the virus.
And then the hunt narrowed to the less lethal strain, variola minor, which was still circulating in the Horn of Africa. In 1977, in Somalia, a hospital cook named Ali Malin contracted the virus.
A hospital cook.
Yeah, he hadn't been vaccinated despite working at a hospital because he was afraid of the needle. He survived his bout with the disease. Health workers tracked down his hundreds of contacts and vaccinated them all. The virus hit the wall.
That was it.
Ali Malin became the last person to naturally contract smallpox. Ironically, he spent the rest of his life working tirelessly on local polio eradication campaigns, trying to bring that same victory to another disease.
And finally, in 1980, after a mandatory waiting period of intense global surveillance to ensure no hidden outbreaks popped up, the WHO officially declared smallpox entirely eradicated from nature.
It is a profound triumph. But we have to look closely at the cost of control and acknowledge that this incredible global coordination rested on a foundation that is inherently fragile: public trust.
This is where we need to talk about what happens when the mechanics of public health collide with the complexities of society. Surveillance, contact tracing, isolation, vaccination mandates, these are incredibly powerful tools, but they are entirely dependent on the public's willingness to cooperate.
They absolutely are.
When trust in the authorities shatters, the tools become useless, and the virus surges back through the cracks.
Trust is not a soft public relations bonus. It is the absolute core operational capacity of public health. A perfect example of how the breakdown of trust fuels a pathogen is the horrific epidemic in Montreal, Canada in 1885.
Walk us through what happened in Montreal, because the death toll was staggering for a city of that size.
Yeah.
Over 5,700 people died.
It's a tragic case study in how ethnic, linguistic, and religious tensions can be weaponized by a virus. Montreal in 1885 was a divided city. The public health authorities and the municipal government were largely English-speaking and Protestant. A large portion of the working-class population was French-speaking and Catholic.
Okay, setting the stage for conflict.
When smallpox was introduced to the city by a railway conductor traveling for Chicago, it began spreading rapidly. The English authorities implemented strict public health measures, including compulsory vaccination and the forced removal of sick individuals to isolation hospitals.
Which, biologically speaking, is the correct move to stop the spread.
Biologically, yes, but sociologically, it was a disaster. The French Catholic community deeply distrusted the English authorities. Rumors spread that the isolation hospitals were death camps and that the mandatory vaccines were tainted or were a deliberate attempt to poison French children.
Oh, that's terrifying.
This anti-vaccination resistance was intense, organized, and sometimes violent. Health inspectors were attacked in the streets. Families actively hid their sick children in closets and attics when the inspectors knocked on their doors.
By hiding the sick, they kept the virus circulating inside crowded, poorly ventilated tenements.
Exactly. The virus thrived in the secrecy. The result was catastrophic. The French-speaking Catholic community bore the absolute brunt of the mortality. In just one 5-week period during the height of the epidemic, 1,391 people died. The vaccine was readily available in the city, but because trust was absent, the shield couldn't be deployed.
We see this tension between public health mandates and individual liberty pop up again just a few years later in the Boston outbreak of 1901 to 1903.
Yes. Boston faced a resurging outbreak and responded with strict compulsory vaccination orders. A man named Henning Jacobson, a Swedish minister living in Cambridge, refused the vaccination.
Why did he refuse?
He argued that a previous vaccination in his youth had caused him severe adverse effects, and he claimed the mandatory order violated his bodily autonomy and his constitutional rights.
He took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
He did. And the resultant 1905 decision, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, is a landmark case in public health law. The Supreme Court ruled against Jacobson. They upheld the state's police power to enforce reasonable public health mandates to protect the community during an active epidemic.
A huge precedent.
The court essentially stated that individual liberty is not absolute when the exercise of that liberty poses a direct mortal threat to the safety of the general public.
It's the core philosophical tension of infectious disease. I mean, if I break my leg, it only affects me. If I refuse a vaccine and contract a highly contagious, deadly virus, my body actively becomes the vehicle by which death reaches my neighbors.
That's the crux of it.
But even with the legal backing of cases like Jacobson, enforcement is an ethical tightrope. Coercion, like sending police to hold someone down and vaccinate them, might technically stop the virus, but it breeds a deep generational resentment and resistance.
Coercion is a blunt instrument that often backfires. Trust is always more durable than force. If a population trusts their institutions, if they believe the vaccine is genuinely safe, if they know they will be treated with dignity at the hospital, if they are given financial support to feed their families while they are forced to isolate, they will willingly cooperate. But public health also constantly battles what epidemiologists call the prevention paradox.
How does the prevention paradox undermine trust?
When a public health intervention is perfectly executed, nothing happens. The disease doesn't spread, nobody dies. But because nothing happens, the general public looks around at all the strict measures, the quarantines, the closed businesses, the mandates, and they say, look, the threat was clearly exaggerated. Why did we undergo all this economic and social pain for a virus that barely did anything?
The success of the intervention makes the intervention look unnecessary.
Exactly. It breeds a dangerous complacency. People begin to dismantle the very public health infrastructure that saved them, which paves the way for the next outbreak. We saw this complacency routinely fail within healthcare settings themselves. Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, but during smallpox outbreaks, they frequently acted as the primary amplifiers of the disease.
Because if a hospital systems aren't perfectly disciplined, it's the perfect environment for the virus. A sick person comes into an ER waiting room, undiagnosed. They sit near vulnerable people. The nursing staff moves from bed to bed without perfect hand hygiene.
The virus just hitches a ride on the staff.
The contaminated bed linens are carried down the hall, aerosolizing the virus into the air. Suddenly, the hospital isn't containing the outbreak, it's the epicenter fueling it.
It requires relentless, unforgiving, systemic discipline to prevent a hospital from becoming a vector.
Which brings us to the most terrifying chapter of this story. Humanity reached the summit in 1980. The WHO declared the disease eradicated from nature. But planting a flag at the top of the mountain didn't mean the danger evaporated, it just mutated. The nature of the risk fundamentally shifted overnight.
It was a profound transition. The biological risk of natural community transmission in villages and cities ended, but it was immediately replaced by administrative risk.
Administrative risk.
The danger wasn't someone coughing on a bus anymore. The danger became human error, poor governance, mislabeled vials, and faulty laboratory freezers.
And we learned that lesson in the most tragic way possible, almost immediately. In 1978, in Birmingham in the UK, a woman named Janet Parker tragically died of smallpox. This is an incredibly sobering case because she died after the last natural case in Somalia.
Janet Parker was a medical photographer at the University of Birmingham. Her studio was located on a floor directly above a laboratory that was conducting active, sanctioned research on the live smallpox virus.
How did she get infected if she wasn't working in the lab?
An extensive investigation revealed a catastrophic failure in the building's infrastructure. The laboratory had a specialized airborne containment system designed to filter the air and keep the virus trapped. But due to poor maintenance and design flaws, the virus escaped the containment cabinet, traveled up through the service ductwork of the building, and infiltrated the telephone exchange room and the photography studio where Janet Parker was working.
Oh my God.
She inhaled the virus, contracted a severe case, and died.
The psychological fallout from that failure was immense.
It was devastating. Her father, who was quarantined, died of a heart attack while she was sick. And the director of the smallpox laboratory, devastated by the guilt of the containment failure, tragically died by suicide before the investigation was even completed. It was a brutal, visceral reminder that eradication from nature does not erase the frailty of human systems.
And that administrative risk isn't just a relic of the 1970s. Fast forward decades later to 2014. Scientists were cleaning out an old, forgotten laboratory space that the FDA had occupied on the NIH campus in Bethesda, Maryland.
I remember this making headlines.
They walk into a cold storage room, open a dusty, unplugged cardboard box, and sitting right there, amongst hundreds of other forgotten biological samples, are 6 glass vials, clearly labeled variola, from the 1950s.
Just sitting in an unsecured box. Now, the freeze-drying process from the 1950s is so effective that the virus inside those vials was still perfectly viable.
Still alive after all those decades.
Thankfully, the glass was intact, nobody was exposed, and the vials were transferred to a high-containment facility and safely destroyed. But it was an absolute heart-stopping wake-up call about the limits of institutional memory. How many other forgotten freezers are out there?
Officially today, live variola virus is permitted to be held in only 2 places on the entire planet. 2 high-security WHO-designated repositories, the CDC in Atlanta and the Victor Institute in Russia. But the existence of those 2 stockpiles fuels an intense, ongoing ethical and scientific debate. Do we destroy these last remaining vials, or do we keep them?
It is a debate where both sides are arguing passionately for public safety. They just weigh the risks completely differently.
Explain the two sides.
The faction advocating for immediate destruction argues that as long as the live virus exists in a freezer, the risk of accidental release or malicious theft by bad actors remains greater than zero. They argue that we have the entire genomic sequence mapped on hard drives. We don't need the physical, deadly virus anymore.
Destroy the siege engine entirely so nobody can ever accidentally turn it on.
Exactly. But the faction advocating for retention counters with a terrifying modern reality. Synthetic biology has advanced exponentially. A well-funded bad actor wouldn't necessarily need to steal the physical virus from the CDC. They could theoretically download the genomic sequence and synthesize the variola virus from scratch in a rogue laboratory.
That is a scary thought.
The retentionists argue that we must keep the live virus to continuously test new antiviral drugs, validate new diagnostic tools, and ensure our modern vaccines still work against the real thing, just in case a synthetic version is ever unleashed.
So while that debate over the freezer in Atlanta rages on, how does modern medicine actually prepare for a disease that doesn't exist in the wild? You can't take a new experimental antiviral drug and test its efficacy on humans because there are no humans with smallpox.
This creates a fascinating regulatory hurdle. To solve it, the FDA created what is known as the animal rule. It allows the FDA to approve new therapeutics for eradicated or highly lethal diseases based heavily on efficacy data from animal models, combined with basic safety trials in healthy humans.
How does that work in practice?
Take modern antivirals like tecovirimat or brincidofovir. Scientists infect animals like non-human primates or rabbits with related lethal orthopox viruses like monkeypox or rabbitpox.
Because they're in the same family.
Right. They administer the experimental antiviral drug to the animals. If the drug consistently stops the related virus and saves the animals, and if phase 1 trials show the drug is safe and non-toxic in healthy human volunteers, the FDA can approve it for the strategic national stockpile to be used against smallpox in an emergency.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a hard look at the modern landscape. We have these newly approved antivirals. We have millions of doses of safer vaccines like JYN-NEOS. We have artificial intelligence that could theoretically scan thousands of electronic health records in real time, looking for an unusual cluster of fever and pustular rash diagnoses.
We have genomic surveillance that can sequence an unknown pathogen in a matter of hours.
But I have to ask you, if an accident happens, or if someone maliciously synthesizes variola and smallpox reappears tomorrow, do we actually have the cultural muscle memory to eradicate it again?
It is the most sobering, urgent question we face. If we look purely at the technology, we are infinitely more prepared today than the health workers were in 1967. AI and genomics are incredible tools for early detection and tracing, but the non-biological barriers we face today are massive and arguably more daunting.
With human factors.
Exactly. We face intense, deeply entrenched political fragmentation. Misinformation and anti-science rhetoric move at the speed of light on social media, vastly outpacing the ability of public health officials to communicate facts.
We've seen how hard that can be.
Our global supply chains for medical equipment are highly optimized but incredibly fragile. And on a practical clinical level, there is hardly a physician or nurse practicing medicine today who has ever laid eyes on a natural case of smallpox.
They wouldn't even know what they're looking at.
The visual recognition, the ability to look across a room and spot the specific progression of the rash, is gone. The disease is a ghost to modern medicine.
So the technology is better, but the societal trust and the human experience required to deploy that technology might be weaker.
That is the core vulnerability. The future of smallpox is not about endemic management. We cannot simply learn to live with a virus that has a 30% mortality rate. The future requires permanent, unblinking, vigilant preparedness.
We can't let our guard down.
AI algorithms and genomic sequencing can serve as the map makers, alerting us to the danger. But human beings in trusted institutions still have to coordinate, communicate, and execute the containment.
Let's bring this all together. What have we actually learned from this deep dive into the archives? We have learned that the variola virus was an absolute biological monster. It was a microscopic siege engine that bypassed our cellular alarms, hijacked our biology, and weaponized our very breath and touch against our neighbors.
It exploited the speed of our ships and the cruelty of our societal inequalities.
That's what humanity defeated it. We didn't do it by wishing it away. We didn't do it by waiting for a miracle. And we didn't even do it just by inventing a brilliant vaccine.
No, is the grind.
We defeated it through the grueling, unglamorous collective discipline of scientists, local health workers, and ordinary communities.
Mm.
It was the invention of the bifurcated needle. It was the logistics of freeze-dried vials. It was the exhausting grind of ring vaccination searching, verifying, tracing, and isolating. Smallpox proves that civilization is not just the roads we build or the technologies we invent. Civilization is fundamentally defined by our willingness to endure hardship to protect a stranger.
It stands as the ultimate testament to human coordination. It proves that when knowledge is coupled with disciplined, coordinated action, even the oldest, most terrifying plagues can be systematically dismantled.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over. For thousands of years, the visible, terrifying scars of smallpox, the deep pockmarks on the faces and arms of the survivors walking through every village and city, served as humanity's visceral, daily reminder to fear the disease.
The evidence was always there.
The evidence of the threat and the necessity of cooperating against it was written directly on the skin of our neighbors. Now that the disease is gone, and those scarred survivors are slowly passing into history, what happens when the physical, visible memory of a plague disappears entirely from our culture?
That's a profound question.
Do we lose the cultural immune system that allows us to cooperate in the face of existential threats? Are we relying completely on cold laboratory protocols, digital models, and frozen vials to keep the dark at bay instead of relying on our shared, visceral human memory?
That is the burden of the vigilance we are tasked with. We must actively choose to remember what we are capable of losing and what we have proven we are capable of achieving.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking out for each other, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.